Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, Baseball the Movie, a new book that blends film criticism and baseball criticism. Noah Gittell joins me on the show to discuss it. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So is this a baseball book filtered through a film lens or a film book filtered through a baseball lens? Or do you see a distinction?
I'd like to say I don't, but I think it's a baseball book first and a film book second, because pretty much every baseball fan likes baseball movies, but not every movie buff likes baseball movies. So, the passion for me in this book was really delving into the game, delving into these films and how it reflects the game, how it reflects changes in the game. So I'd have to say, if you're a baseball fan, this is definitely the book for you. If you're a movie fan, you might find something you like in it.
Right. Like not everyone loves like rom-coms. If you're a movie lover, baseball movies are kind of a genre unto themselves too.
Yeah, and I would say they're probably even more of a niche genre than
right.
rom-coms, especially these days.
True enough. So when did the kind of kernel of the idea for this book start, right? Like I know you talk about kind of your love of baseball and when that started in introducing the book, but like the concept of like looking at taking a critical film scholar eye and looking at, what we can tell from the way baseball's represented over the years in film.
Well, I've always been interested in looking at film this way, kind of looking at different genres, different aspects of cinema and seeing how it changes over time, and then identifying how those changes reflect broader changes in society or broader changes in Hollywood. And I picked the baseball film for this book simply because it is my comfort food genre. I mean, these movies, I love them. I have no problem living with them for 3 years, which is really how long it takes to write a book when you consider the whole process. And, for me, just loving a genre is not just about nostalgia. It's about trying to understand it as much as possible. And I just felt the baseball movie was such a rich text because it combines these two national pastimes of America, which are baseball and movies. And the history of those two things are intertwined, and the history of those two things run on very interesting parallel tracks at the same time. So there was just so much to delve into, and it seemed like the perfect place, the perfect topic for a book, something that I really loved and something that had sort of an endless supply of ideas behind it.
So you had to have a sense that this is something you could pursue for 3 years, knowing you were going to have to go deep on it, like that it wouldn't wear itself out on you?
Yeah, exactly. And it did wear itself out on me a little bit. I mean, when you're watching a minor baseball movie for the fourth time just to make, catch one detail that you weren't sure about or something. There were some moments when I was like, well, I'm not sure this was such a good idea. But overall, it was really a joy. I mean, I really do love these movies. And frankly, I think the movies need my advocacy because we're not in a great era of baseball films right now. So as someone who loves the genre, I considered it, important work to really bring a little sunlight to them and remind people how great they are.
You mentioned watching, a minor film for the fourth time. I am curious about kind of the process. Like, did you come up with a list of baseball movies or like how did you kind of start to plot out what this book would become?
Well, it could have just been a list of my favorite baseball movies. And that was an idea that I pitched very early on in the process, just sort of a book of essays. But the core idea here, as I mentioned, is that baseball is this fountain of Americana. So I really looked for films that reflected something about what was going on in the culture at the time. And that meant leaving some films that I love mostly out of the book. I mean, one of my favorite baseball movies is actually Fever Pitch. And it's a great movie. I didn't think there was enough there to have a whole chapter about it or even half a chapter. It does get a little mention in the book, but it's just a really fun, sweet, silly movie. And so it didn't kind of meet the standard of saying something important about either baseball or the culture at large.
Well, yeah, like something like Fever Pitch, like that's much more about the stands, right? Like the fandom rather than what happens on the field. And maybe in some ways that, in the same, I think a little before that was The Fan, right? The Robert De Niro, Wesley Snipes movie. And we started to kind of introduce this notion of like, what do baseball players owe us? Or, what do we bring to the game as viewers? And I suppose there is like some angle there about kind of like the contemporary society and like how we view paid performers and our relationship under like capitalism. But I suppose you have to kind of pick your spots.
So, yeah, I think you're exactly right. The Fan is a really interesting example that I actually had something about The Fan in the book, but I ended up cutting it. I think that's not a great movie, but it's an interesting movie because it came out in 1996 before the whole steroid era really crashed and burned. And yet it sort of predicts the complicated relationship that fans had with the players in the fallout of the steroid era. That real sourness that movie shows. You got this character who loves this player, but then also hates him sort of at the same time. That movie really predicted that. And I agree with you. Fever Pitch is sort of playing in the same area. So that's the thing about the baseball movie. You know, it always has something to say about what's going on in the culture. The question was just like, is there enough to like build a whole chapter? And does it fit into the broader narrative, the way the baseball movie has shifted over time?
So you've got this list of baseball movies, like the recorded era of baseball movies. Do you then kind of look at, I got to place these in a chronology, right? Like, so I can kind of mirror what's going on in America versus what's going on in these baseball movies. But then are you pinpointing like, okay, I want to excise this. I want to take this era and think about the macro of it and where the baseball fits in the micro sense?
Absolutely, because there are 5 sections of the book and 3 or 4 chapters in each section, but each section represents an era and there's an idea behind that section too. So these films are grouped together not just chronologically, but by what broader idea they are expressing. So for example, looking at the 1970s, you've got 3 films, Bang the Drum Slowly, Bingo Long, and The All-Stars, and The Bad News Bears. And looking at those films through the prism of the 1970s in America, in the Watergate era, the Vietnam era, this great disillusionment in our institutions, it really helps you pull out some kind of fascinating things in each of them and find connections between the films that you might not have found otherwise. And of course, the 70s are also such an important era for cinema, the era of New Hollywood, when all these young subversive filmmakers were getting their shots with bigger budgets. So there's plenty to pick at there, but the grouping of them was really fun because you end up making connections that you might not have seen otherwise.
Are you trying to watch them in some sort of grouping to be like, what do I see that kind of ties these all together? Or like, are you looking at kind of like historically, like around the time they were made, what was going on that might have bled in?
Yes, definitely that. I mean, I had an idea for some of them because, I mean, let's be honest, most of these movies I had seen before more than once. So I already had some ideas going into it. But yeah, I'm definitely looking at the culture. And the 70s was an era I was very familiar with. The 80s and 90s, I grew up in that era, so I knew what was going on then. Looking at the post-war era in the 50s that required a bit more research and was a little more challenging. Looking at the Jackie Robinson story and Pride of the Yankees and the Stratton story. I mean, these were films that they're in the sphere of really big, important events in American history. We're talking about the Civil Rights era. We're talking about some of the difficulties that happened after World War II with post-traumatic stress disorder. These things are referenced in the films, if not obliquely, then directly. And I did definitely have to study up a bit on those eras to be clear about what I was saying. But that's just one of the great pleasures of writing a book. You learn a lot of things that you weren't even intended to.
You mentioned, the 70s, the post-Watergate and the Bad News Bears. I hadn't really thought of this, because you see it as a kid and it's like, it's hilarious. There's like this slouch of a coach and the kids are, getting up to no good. And you just appreciate it on like a kid level. But that all the adults are not really trustworthy. And you're talking about an era in which like the government, which is like the adult, is not trustworthy. And that like this is a reflection of, the average citizen kind of being disappointed with the people that they thought were looking out for their interests. And ultimately they're looking out for their own interests.
Absolutely. I think when you're a kid, you don't really know from the government. Your only authority are the adults who are in your life. So it's a really good metaphor for the greater disillusionment that people were facing in America in the 1970s. I also just think, going into the 70s, baseball had been in cinema, sort of a paragon of optimism and righteousness. And just to make a movie where the coach is a drunk and the kids curse at each other and spit and act obnoxious. We're still coming out of the era here of Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. We're not that far removed from that sort of portrayal of suburban life and the relationship between kids and adults. So really everything about that movie, I think, is very subversive, and putting it in the realm of baseball makes it even more subversive because that is the thing that we hold up as like the ideal Americana.
Yeah, ultimately, like, I don't think kids have necessarily changed in terms of like their precociousness or like not necessarily being like perfect. It wasn't like in the 50s. I think it's that like rose-colored glasses that we applied to, past eras that kids get up to stuff. And
definitely.
And always
and the
have.
films of the 70s, I mean, that's what they did. They showed life how it really is in many ways. And obviously it was still glorified, and Hollywood, they gussied it up a lot, but it was a more authentic era of filmmaking for sure. And I think Bang the Drum Slowly fits into that as well. It's, a harsher tale of what life is like in the major leagues. And Bingo Long does too, because this was the first portrayal of something that resembled the Negro Leagues in cinema really ever, because the Jackie Robinson story barely touched on it. So I think that whole era is about kind of lifting the veil and showing you more of what baseball and life in America is really like.
Yeah, you place the Bang the Drum Slowly kind of in concert with Jim Bouton's Ball 4, right? Like that the here's what actually happens in the locker room. These aren't your heroes. I mean, you think of like Mickey Mantle's press stories versus Mickey Mantle, the Jane Levitt book about him, right? Like that it's a vastly different person. The Bang the Drum Slowly is like these guys are kind of jerks. Like even when they're redeemed, they're still not the greatest people.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Jim Bouton's book was such a phenomenon at the time. It's kind of hard to imagine what it would be like reading that book in 1970, because now, having gone through the steroid era and just the transparency that we have in terms of what these players, what our heroes are like, it was completely different back then. The journalists looked the other way. They didn't talk about what players did when they were on the road and behind closed doors. So Bouton's book, which was an account of one season for this journeyman pitcher, really blew the lid off of what life was really like as a major leaguer. And Bang the Drum Slowly, it's not an expose, it's a drama. And it has some moments of comedy as well. But the kind of core theme of the movie is that the players are jerks. Even the lead character, our protagonist, he's not a nice guy. He does one nice thing over the course of this season, which is that he puts in his contract that this catcher, who's probably about to be sent down to the minor leagues, cannot be dropped from the team unless he is dropped as well. And that's this one courageous thing he does. But I don't think we get the sense at the end of it that he's turned into a great person overnight. The stakes are much lower. The ceiling is much lower for how great these guys can be. And that was a revolutionary change for the baseball film.
So Bingo Long, as you mentioned, looks at the Negro Leagues, or a representation of the barnstorming that happened kind of outside of the Negro Leagues as the team decides to, quit the league and go do their own thing. As much as it fits within the 70s Bad News Bears, it seems to be part of a thread that you weave between the Jackie Robinson and the 42, that representation of black baseball, it's always somewhat loaded, right, within Hollywood. You get questions of representation in film just generally, in the macro level, but then white savior element of the Jackie Robinson story with the Branch Rickey that is echoed with the Harrison Ford portrayal in 42, right? That it wasn't so much him as the decision by management to sign him that broke the color barrier. I'm curious, did you watch those three movies kind of in concert with each other, or was it just kind of you wrote about them and pulled these threads and wove them together in some sense when you were kind of writing the book?
No, I definitely went through a phase where I watched all the Negro Leagues films together, and that included the three you mentioned. It also included Soul of the Game, which is an HBO movie. It's quite good, actually. I watched the Court Martial of Jackie Robinson, which is a little seen TNT movie starring the late Andre Brower. And then I watched Fences as well, which I wrote about in the book, which doesn't have any actual baseball in it. But I think through that character played by Denzel Washington, it really captures kind of the disillusionments of that generation better than any of the movies. The Branch Rickey stuff is definitely important. And as you note, the fact that the narrative really didn't change at all from the Jackie Robinson story in 1950 to the film 42, 60 years later, is really interesting to me. But the thing, when we talk about Bingo Long and put it in concert with these other two, that is most interesting to me is how in all tellings of the Jackie Robinson story, they do elide his time in the Negro Leagues and in the minor leagues for that matter, which could be a film all its own. And one thing I learned when writing this book, and I'm a little embarrassed to say I didn't think much about before, was how integration killed the Negro Leagues. And, these were Black-owned teams. They really were this great kind of center for Black communities where fans could go and watch players they related to, and the money was going back into the Black communities because they were owned by local residents. And Branch Rickey, stole Jackie Robinson from the Negro Leagues. He didn't have any contract there because they didn't really deal with contracts. And once that became a thing, it was just a huge talent drain on the Negro Leagues, and they became a shell of what they were. And it was, 10 years later or so that they were gone altogether. And none of these films really show that, except for Bingo Long, which doesn't have Jackie Robinson in it, but there's sort of a Jackie Robinson figure who towards the end does get brought up to the majors. And there's a beautiful scene towards the end between James Earl Jones and Billy D. Williams where they're sort of reckoning with what this is going to mean for their future. So I think the film has some problems as a film. It's not quite as funny as it needs to be, and there's some pacing issues, but in terms of getting at the issues that Hollywood typically ignores, it's really important.
Yeah, it sometimes it reminds me of like the movie Car Wash from around the same time, where it's like, like it's meant to be like almost like early SNL like sketches stitched together or something. Like it is a bit disjointed, but it does have a lot to say about kind of that era of baseball that hadn't been and hasn't been represented in film subsequent to that. Was there any film that was not necessarily like a film you like, but was great to write about? Did you find like something that had like a lot of meat on the bone that you're like, this isn't necessarily my favorite baseball film, but as an opportunity to like go deep on this topic, it provides a lot?
Definitely Fear Strikes Out would be a good example of that. And this is the baseball in it is some of the worst that's ever been put on film. So it's the true story of Jim Pearsall, who was a hotshot prospect who came up to the majors, played for the Red Sox, and developed this really bad anxiety disorder. He acted out a lot on the field. He had incidents where he would get in fights all the time, and he was just always creating trouble. And eventually he was treated in a mental hospital. And it was this kind of cautionary tale about, what can happen when a player is pushed too hard. And he's played by Tony Perkins, better known as Norman Bates in Psycho, and good actor, not much of an athlete. And some of the scenes in the movie are just comically bad, the way they try to hide the fact that he really can barely throw a baseball. But I found it to be an interesting movie to write about towards the end of the 50s. It sort of expresses a lot of anxiety and psychological distress that was becoming normalized at that time. I mean, this was an era in which therapy was becoming much more common, for suburban people. The stigma was sort of being eliminated and it was being taken more seriously at a national level. And I think Fear Strikes Out, it definitely reflects that. When you take, on some level, this guy's arc for much of the movie is just like all the other movies we'd seen in baseball. He's a young kid with talent. He works his way up the ladder. He gets to the majors. But then what happens? The setback that he suffers is different than, what Jackie Robinson suffers or what Stratton suffers in the Stratton story. His is a mental health condition. And that's a really important distinction. And it really does show what was going on at the time. So that was fun to dig into, and also sort of discuss it within the contours of Tony Perkins' life as well, he had an interesting life himself.
Yeah, you don't just get into the movies, but like some of the backstories of some of the performers, right? Like, because you're also talking about like how baseball is played in these games and whether like it looks like baseball, and that very often it doesn't. But that like a Jimmy Stewart and like you've got what happened to these guys, like wartime service and their physique, where they were at in their careers in Hollywood and what this represented and stuff. How much of that did you just kind of know, and how much of that was like you needed to go research to kind of round out the picture on these things?
No, the Gary Cooper, Jimmy Stewart stuff was all new to me. And for your listeners, I'll summarize briefly. But Pride of the Yankees, when Gary Cooper made that film, he knew nothing about baseball. He had been raised in England for some of his childhood, and he sort of missed the boat for baseball. So him learning how to play was like a major behind the scenes story of the film. It was reported on by the press, and there was a lot of skepticism that he would be able to make it look good on camera. And they ended up fudging it quite a bit and inventing a lot of techniques for filming baseball that were used throughout the genre's subsequent history. But Jimmy Stewart, on the other hand, he could play baseball. And in fact, in the beginning of the Stratton story, which to me is like the next major baseball film after Pride of the Yankees, you see a shot of him pitching in like a local game, catching the ball that is thrown back to him by the catcher, turning around so you can see his face, and then spinning back around and throwing a perfect strike. So he really wanted to show that he could play. But that film, to me, is very much about, it's sort of a metaphor, the traumas of World War II, because his character loses a leg. Not at war, he loses a leg in a hunting accident, but the disillusionment and the bitterness that he goes through, I think is really meant to evoke the shell-shocked epidemic after that war. And Jimmy Stewart did go to war in real life. He fought many aerial battles. He was highly decorated, and he was deeply traumatized by it. So it's very interesting to watch those scenes of that character with an amputated leg, bitter at the misfortune he has suffered, and sort of think about all that Stewart is putting into it.
Yeah, if memory serves, I think you contrast it with like the movie The Best Years of Our Lives. Stratton's story kind of, it's a baseball film, but in more so it's like it fits with like a post-war like reckoning kind of film.
Absolutely. It's not literally about the war, but I think it definitely is digging at that at a subtextual level.
Right. In the same way that like noir films, like those crime films didn't necessarily like, they weren't out and out war films, but they were wrestling with kind of like GIs returning home and not knowing what to do with themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the great thing about film, especially in that era when it was the primary form of entertainment and it was trying to appeal to the entire country. It can't help but reflect what's going on because it has to resonate with people on some deep, deep level. So it's really fun to look at those films, especially the genres that we're talking about today, and just kind of sort through what we think it might be saying. And there's obviously no one right answer, but part of the pleasure of writing a book is I get to give my answer.
So the dearth of modern baseball movies, then, does that reflect the disenchantment or like disconnection with the game itself, right? That like what was called America's pastime would now probably be like fourth on the like sports hierarchy?
I think you're onto something. I think that's part of it. Baseball is definitely not the #1 sport in America anymore. I think by numbers, it's third behind football and basketball. And that's an issue. But, Hollywood has also gone through a lot of changes as well. And the sort of mid-budget, star-driven film for grown-ups that, in the 80s, for example, that was where the baseball movie made its living. Those don't really exist anymore in Hollywood. We heard Cord Jefferson talk about this at the Oscars the other night.
The $10-20 million films, yeah.
Exactly. So that's definitely a problem for the baseball film because baseball films are not cheap to make, first of all. And also, they're not actually usually driven by a single movie star. So they're often driven by ensembles. And when Hollywood does ensembles now, they like to put movie stars in the ensembles. So it's just a hard thing to sort of put together and make it work financially. There have been baseball movies over the last 10 or 15 years, but none of them have really been monster hits the way they were in the 80s. And Hollywood is a copycat industry. So it's going to take one kind of baseball film to break free and really make its mark on the culture for the genre to return, I think.
Yeah, like there's the occasion, like I saw there's this movie The Hill, and like
not good.
That like we've had something like Phenom, or you talk about Sugar in the book. Like there's been like kind of minor like indie films looking at baseball. The other area that you talk about in the book is like the like Christian films. That like, did you know of this genre like going into this, or is this something you discovered in your research that you're like, okay, I guess I'm going to do a bit on this?
I had no idea that these films existed. And if you look at the last 15 years, I would reckon there have been more baseball films made over the last 15 years than in any other 15-year period in history. The thing is, they're all these direct-to-DVD or direct-to-streaming faith-based baseball films that if you're not part of evangelical community, you will never have heard of. I mean, some of them star like Kirk Cameron, and Dean Cain is in one of them. Oftentimes they have one like D-level actor who was in a movie 30 years ago that was really popular, and they're sort of the star, and then everyone else around it they're actors from the Christian evangelical community. And I will say there's a spectrum here. Some of them are just god-awful, and they're just sermons in movie form. And then there are others that are a little more like real movies, but have Christian messages sort of underlying them. I watched a lot of them, and most of them were quite bad. But I do think it speaks to how, some of the values that we associate with the traditional baseball film are not really in vogue in the broader culture right now. I mean, baseball films are inherently patriotic,
Mm-hmm.
and baseball films often have family values, traditional values. And when it comes to pop culture, that kind of stuff is pretty segmented into like these niche Christian evangelical communities. So if there were another baseball film that were going to be a big hit, I don't think it would have those values anymore. But for people who love those old films, there is this well of faith-based baseball films that you can go to and get your fix.
Mm-hmm. You'd mentioned that, baseball films, not necessarily star-driven, right, that it's ensemble-oriented. I mean, one of the most epochal ensemble ones is 8 Men Out, and you get John Sayles to do the foreword for this book. Did you just, like, blind approach him, or, like, how did you go about getting him to do that?
I got to say I'm pretty proud of how I played it. I'd never met him before. I found his agent's contact information, and I asked him to sit for an interview for the book, for the 8 Men Out chapter. And I actually wasn't even thinking about having him write the foreword yet at that point. But he sat for an interview. We talked for about an hour, and he was great. He's just one of these older guys who just wants to talk about baseball. I mean, we talked about the film for about 20, 25 minutes, and then it was just us trading stories about old random players. And we had a great time and had a great connection. And then I saw that he was introducing a screening of Eight Men Out near me down at Yale University and here in Connecticut. They do free screenings every week down there, and he lives in Connecticut. So I went down there and I talked to him face to face and just made the connection again and said hello. And then I just emailed him and asked if he would write it. And I didn't hear back for about a few weeks, and I was pretty sure he had ignored me. And then he just sent me an email with the whole forward written, and that was a great moment, because you write a book and you don't know how if people are going to like it or hate it, but knowing that he was willing to put his name on the book alongside mine meant a great deal to me.
Yeah, for sure. Getting a stamp of approval from a guy who has a baseball film like that in his filmography is an impressive thing.
He snuck baseball into some of his other movies too. I watched Matewan not that long ago, which is his movie about a terrible bloody clash between union strikers and management. And there's a scene in that movie actually of James Earl Jones playing baseball in a field. So that's another John Sayles baseball moment.
And another James Earl Jones one.
And another James Earl Jones baseball moment as well.
Field of Dreams, Bingo Long, and Matewan. I'm going to have to rewatch Matewan because I had completely forgotten there's a baseball scene.
Yeah.
There's a few kind of like aside chapters, right? Almost like little aperitifs from like the meals of the individual sections. How did you land on like what you were going to write about in those? Like, because it feels like I really want to do this, but it doesn't merit its own chapter. Like, is it that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There were some things I just felt needed to be mentioned in the book, or people would be upset, or frankly, I would be upset. And one of them involves The Naked Gun, which I could not justify being a baseball movie by my definition. Like 30 minutes of baseball in it towards the end. And I just felt that we got to find a way to work this in. So I wrote a little something about that. And then I thought, there's all these other movies that are not baseball movies, but they have baseball scenes in them. So how can I work that into the book? And I just came up with this idea of a list of the 10 best baseball scenes in non-baseball movies. And then the last one, I was so fortunate enough to get some time with Richard Linklater, who, to me, he is the closest thing we have to like the baseball filmmaker of our generation. He's made a couple baseball movies. He's touched on baseball and some more of them. And it took a long time to get through to him, but I did eventually. And he sat down with me for about an hour, and I just published that interview basically word for word. And it was a delight.
Yeah, no, his backstory is fascinating, right? Like the college ball player who like pivoted to film and has like just, as far as like representations go, something like Everybody Wants Some. Baseball lovers love that movie.
They absolutely do. He also made a really great documentary about Augie Garrido, who was the coach at University of Texas of their baseball team for many years. It's kind of hard to find, but it's out there. It's called Inning by Inning. And it's a fascinating movie. I mean, on the one hand, it's fascinating to just see behind the scenes of a college baseball season at a top program. But Garrido is also kind of a very Linklater figure. He's a bit of a poet, a bit of a jock. He's a perfect protagonist for this director. And I highly recommend people seek it out because it's worth seeing.
All right. Well, it's always good to get one more recommendation in from a book this voluminous with its recommendations. Baseball, the movie's out via Triumph Books. Noah Gittell, thanks very much for taking some time to join me on the program.
Such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.